Her workday probably starts a lot like yours, even if you don't carry a purse. At 8 o'clock, Wang Yuefei is out the door. She's a sales rep in Beijing, working for Johnson & Johnson. She likes her apartment, she enjoys her job, and this might sound familiar, she hates her daily commute, even though Wang has it better than many of her fellow Beijingers. And today, she invited me along for the ride.
Many people have 2 hours, more than 2 hours, 3 hours to get to work.
Each way. Wow. From what I saw in China, Wang is a typical city dweller. Small apartment, lots of walking, lots of public transportation, not much driving. I mean, yeah, there are 4 million cars crammed into Beijing's roads, but remember, this city is home to 22 million people. So, to put it another way, Wang, a typical Chinese, would be an atypical American. Okay, that needs a little explanation and some perspective as well. China and the US, we're neck and neck in terms of the carbon emissions we crank out. But China's annual carbon emissions cover a population of 1.3 billion people. The US needs only a little more than 300 million to churn out about the same amount of pollution.
When we're talking about the average energy consumption per capita in China, it's still relatively low compared with other developed countries.
She means the United States, of course. Yeah, we love our big cars, and our AC, and our widescreen TVs. And that affection means to power all our stuff, we burn lots of fossil fuels, especially coal for electricity, and of course, oil. But here's the catch. As the Chinese get wealthier, more of them are starting to live like Americans. China's burning through more coal and oil every single year, and that has EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson concerned. I spoke with her in Beijing.
Because of the rate of their development, they're still growing, and their energy output and energy emissions are going to continue to grow, even though, compared to the United States, they use a lot less energy per person.
But using less energy? Well, I found out that takes a lot of energy. It's 8:15, and I want you to keep an eye on that subway worker in the yellow jacket. You see her there, lending a helping hand? An everyday reality with so many Chinese competing for so few subway seats. Eventually, we cram our way on board as well.
Once said, this is not the worst time. It actually gets more crowded than this.
That's because the Chinese are rushing from rural areas to urban centers, moving to big cities to find work. They're part of the biggest mass migration in human history. As many as 20 million people moving every single year.
This is a huge challenge for them in so many ways that, you know, are they thinking about emissions when they're thinking about that? I don't think so.
But maybe they should, because a Chinese moves from the interior of the country to one of these mega cities, and his or her carbon emissions skyrocket.
Absolutely.
When Chinese come to the city, they become a bit more like us Americans. They get access to air conditioning, cars, and satellite TV, part of the reason China's emission levels are rising. The other reason? In the US, about 3/4 of our carbon emissions come from us, people, our lifestyles. The rest come from industry, making stuff. In China, though, it's pretty much the opposite. About 3/4 of the carbon emissions come from industry, and only that remaining quarter comes from the way the Chinese live their lives. And that point isn't lost on the central government. This fall, China shut down more than 2,000 factories. Facilities, it says, were wasting energy. The Chinese government is quick to tout its voluntary carbon intensity reduction targets, essentially pledging to limit the growth of its carbon emissions to the growth of its economy. The problem there is the China economy is roaring forward, and the electricity to power all of these gargantuan towers behind me here in Shanghai and all of the new buildings that are now under construction, more than 70% of that electricity comes from burning coal.
Look, I mean, their emissions will go up less if their carbon intensity targets are ambitious and they fulfill them. But will it stop the overall emissions trend? No.
Back to Beijing, 8:35, and we're walking to our next subway train. How much longer would it take you if you were driving to work?
Driving, half an hour. More than half, 1.5 hours.
Saving time, saving a hassle, saving money. That's why an American might, say, buy a smaller TV. That's why Chinese like Wang will endure such an outrageous commute day after day. That's how countries find common ground and agree to cut their emissions.
Between our two economies, we're at different ends of the scale, but we're both working on some pretty similar issues.
Chinese or American, that's how we make our own energy choices every single day. 8:50 a.m., almost an hour after we left Wang's apartment, and we're on our final hot and crowded ride. This one, an elevator. And then we're at work.
For Wang, how she gets here isn't about saving gasoline.
The important thing is saving my time.
But according to the International Energy Agency, time is running out. Chinese or American, we need to find new ways to get our energy, or find ways to cope with a much warmer planet. In Beijing, China, Tyler Souters. Thanks again, Mom. Energy Now.